Hello and welcome to Democracies of the World, our show on Sansad TV where we take you through the latest happenings from Parliament across the globe. In today's episode, we will talk about elections in major democracies of the world. In the next half an hour, we will also take a look at how parliamentary structure of Malaysia works. I'm your host, Bhwana Nayar. Let's begin our show with Nepal's parliamentary polls. The counting of votes in the elections to the House of Representatives in 7 provincial assemblies, which began on November 21st, is expected to be complete this week. The Nepali Congress-led ruling alliance is poised to retain office in Kathmandu. However, the trend suggests a divided polity with voters refusing to give a decisive mandate to any party. The CPN-UML, the main opposition group, too will have a substantial presence in the federal parliament. Top leaders of the 5-party ruling alliance led by Nepali Congress earlier this week held several rounds of intense meetings on forming a new government and power-sharing mechanism. A party needs at least 138 seats to form a majority government in the 275-member House of Representatives. Nepal is said to have a hung parliament following its general election on November 20th, according to analysts. This raises fear of instability in the Himalayan nation, which has witnessed 30 governments in as many years. Take a look.
With no party getting a simple majority in the general election, Nepal is facing a hung parliament, even as the ruling Nepali Congress-led 5-party alliance tops the vote count. Although the final result has yet to be released, it is already clear no political party or alliance will win a majority of seats in the House of Representatives. There are 2 major political alliances contesting the polls: the ruling Nepali Congress-led Democratic and Leftist Alliance and the CPN-UML-led Leftist and Pro-Hindu, Pro-Monarchy Alliance. CPN-UML is far from securing the majority. The general elections were held in Nepal on 20th of November. This is the second federal and provincial elections in Nepal after the promulgation of the constitution in 2015 September. In the 275-member House of Representatives, 165 will be elected through direct voting, while the remaining 110 will be elected through a proportional electoral system. A party or a coalition needs 138 seats for a clear majority. Similarly, elections were conducted for unicameral provincial assemblies for all 7 provinces. There are 550 provincial seats in all of 7 provinces of Nepal, of which 330, 60%, will be elected through first past the post, and 220, 40% of seats will be elected through proportional representation. Experts meanwhile say that without a clear winner, political instability could persist in Nepal as it faces slowing economic growth and rising inflation. Political instability has been a recurrent feature of Nepal's parliament since the end of the decade-long Maoist insurgency, and no prime minister has served a full term after the civil war ended in 2006. The frequent changes and fighting among parties have been blamed for the country's slow economic growth. Elections to the House of Representatives and 7 provincial assemblies were held to end the prolonged political instability that has plagued the Himalayan nation. The next government will face challenges of keeping a stable political administration, reviving the tourism industry and balancing ties with neighbours India and China. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
Moving on, Hakeem Jeffries was unanimously elected on Wednesday to become the Democratic Party's top leader in the US House of Representatives beginning in January, making him the first Black American to hold such a high-ranking position in Congress. The vote by Jeffries' fellow Democrats also marked the rise of a younger generation of leaders in the 435-member House and the end of the Nancy Pelosi era and control by other Democrats in their 80s. Jeffries, a 52-year-old New Yorker, will hold the position of House Democratic leader for the 118th Congress that convenes on January 3rd. Jeffries pledged to work to make life better for everyday Americans and to find opportunities to partner with Republicans whenever possible. Meanwhile, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is facing a possible impeachment threat over a farm scandal. The president has been accused of covering up a $4 million theft from his farm in 2020, including kidnapping and bribing the burglars into silence. A three-member panel's findings have been handed to Parliament, which is set to examine them and decide whether or not to launch impeachment proceedings next week. The panel formed in September sought to find any preliminary evidence of wrongdoing by the president. Ramaphosa has denied wrongdoing. He is less than a month away from a conference which will decide if he can run for a second term with his party, the African National Congress, in 2024. Moving on to our next story, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has said that the so-called golden era of relations with China is over, as the UK needs to evolve its approach towards Beijing. He made the remarks while addressing Lord Mayor's banquet in London. In his first foreign policy speech, the British Prime Minister said the closer economic ties of the previous decade had been naive. He said the UK now needed to replace wishful thinking with robust pragmatism towards competitors. Sunak also condemned a recent attack on a BBC journalist in Beijing. The speech comes after protests in China over the weekend against the country's strict COVID lockdown laws. He said that China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests.
The so-called golden era is over, along with the naive idea that trade would automatically lead to social and political reform. But nor should we rely on simplistic Cold War rhetoric. We recognise China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism. Instead of listening to their people's protests, the Chinese government has chosen to crack down further, including by assaulting a BBC journalist.
And news now from Australia. Australian Parliament on Wednesday voted to censure former Liberal Prime Minister Scott Morrison after an inquiry found his secret appointment to multiple ministries during the COVID-19 pandemic undermined trust in government. Morrison, who lost power in a general election in May this year, secretly accumulated 5 ministerial roles during the pandemic. The historic motion brought by the ruling Labour Party passed by 86 votes to 50 in the country's lower house. It marks the first time a former Prime Minister has been censured by Parliament, though the motion is symbolic in nature. Meanwhile, listing his achievements in government, Australia's former Prime Minister Scott Morrison said he gave himself additional ministerial powers at a time that Australia was dealing with extreme uncertainty and unpredictability. Take a listen.
Which found that the actions of the former Prime Minister fundamentally undermined the principles of responsible government, because the former Prime Minister wasn't responsible to the Parliament and through the Parliament to the electors for the departments that he was appointed to administer, and that had real consequences of acting to undermine public confidence in government and were corrosive of trust in government.
Have you ever had to deal with a crisis where the outlook was completely unknown? In such circumstances, were you able to get all the decisions perfectly right?
Moving on, local elections in Taiwan over the weekend resulted in a defeat for the Democratic Progressive Party and a Kuomintang victory. The opposition KMT won several major races, including the capital Taipei. The vote has drawn global attention as Taiwan becomes a bigger geopolitical flashpoint between China and the US. Local issues eclipsed the security strategy on which the independence-leaning DPP campaigned. Appeals to patriotism and concerns such as China-United States relations or the perceived threat from the mainland did not resonate strongly and failed to get supporters out. In the wake of the election result, President Tsai Ing-wen of the DPP resigned as party chair to take the responsibility for her party's losses. The elections for local council and city mayors theoretically have a domestic focus, covering issues such as crime, housing and social welfare, and those elected will not have a direct say on Taiwan's policy regarding China. Slipping into a very short break here, we'll be back with more news on democracies of the world. You stay tuned to Sansad TV. Welcome back. You're watching our special program, Democracies of the World. Moving on, Malaysian last week appointed reformist leader Anwar Ibrahim as the country's prime minister, ending days of uncertainty after divisive general elections produced a hung parliament. Anwar Ibrahim, 75, sworn in as nation's 10th leader. Who is Anwar Ibrahim and what are the challenges facing Malaysia's new prime minister? Take a look.
After several days of post-election deadlock in Malaysia, veteran opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim was on November 24th appointed the Prime Minister by King Sultan Abdullah. Anwar Ibrahim sworn in as the 10th Prime Minister of Malaysia.
Saya, Anwar bin Ibrahim, setelah dilantik memegang jawatan seorang Perdana Menteri.
Anwar's appointment caps a 3-decade-long journey from heir apparent to a prisoner convicted of sodomy to long-time opposition leader. In the elections held on November 19th, Anwar's Pakatan Harapan party won the biggest share of seats, 82, short of the 112 majority it needed to form a government on its own. Former Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin's right-leaning National Alliance won 73 seats, with its ally Pan-Malaysian Islamic Party emerging as the biggest single party with 49 seats. For several days, there were intense deliberations that included discussions concerning various combinations of parties and political alliances to help the party come to power. Political and ideological differences, however, resulted in a stalemate, forcing the country's king to step in. Anwar emerged victorious after other smaller blocs agreed to support him for a unity government.
This is a unity government. It transcends beyond keadilan or DAP or Amanah or OPCO or Pakatan Harapan. Our intention is to ensure that we have stability and focus on the economy. Malaysia is more than 6 decades old. Every Malaysian, regardless of ethnicity, religious belief or region, particularly Sabah and Sarawak, should be left to feel that they are ignored in any way. None should be marginalized under my administration.
A veteran leader in Malaysia's politics, Ibrahim began his political career as a student activist and in 1971 founded the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia. In the early years of his political career, he started leading protests against rural poverty and on other socio-economic causes in the country. Ibrahim's political influence caught the eye of then Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who convinced him to join the ruling United Malays National Organisation Party. However, as the financial crisis of the 1990s worsened, the relationship between Mahathir and Ibrahim deteriorated. The 75-year-old Ibrahim has time and again been denied the premiership, despite getting within striking distance over the years. He was Deputy Prime Minister in the 1990s and Official Prime Minister in waiting in 2018. In between, he spent nearly a decade in jail for sodomy and corruption, in what he says were politically motivated charges aimed at ending his career. Analysts, meanwhile, believe the path is not going to be an easy one for Anwar. He has been handed the leadership of a country that is still reeling from the long-drawn impact of COVID-19. He's also facing political leaders who are deeply divided. Malaysia's citizens also want to see the new government address corruption, defend democratic rights, and ensure the independence of key institutions such as Parliament and the judiciary. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
Malaysia is a parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy in which the king plays a largely ceremonial role, although he has a certain discretionary powers. Let's take a look at the parliamentary structure of Malaysia.
Parliament of Malaysia represents the democratic structure of the government and reflects the people's aspiration through the elected representatives. The Parliament is the national legislature of Malaysia based on the Westminster system. Following the first general election after independence, Parliament of Malaysia held its first meeting on 11th September 1959. The Parliament assembles in the Malaysian Houses of Parliament located in the national capital city of Kuala Lumpur. It is the highest legislative body of the country that consists of three main components: the King, Senate, and House of Representatives. The King is the supreme commander for the Malaysian Armed Forces. The King carries out his duties under the Constitution and act according to the advice of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. The Senate consists of 70 senators. The membership of the Senate is made up of two categories: 26 members elected by the State Legislative Assembly to represent 13 states, each state represented by 2 members. 44 members appointed by the King on the advice of the Prime Minister, including 2 members from the Federal Territory of Kuala Lumpur and 1 member each from the Federal Territory of Labuan and Putrajaya. The tenure of office is a 3-year term for a maximum of 2 terms, applicable to both federal and state appointments. The House of Representatives has 222 elected members and each member represents a parliamentary constituency. A general election is held every 5 years to elect members of the House of Representatives. Parties with the most elected members can form a federal government to rule the country. Elections are held every 5 years unless the Prime Minister calls for an early poll. The election process is based on the first past the post system, which means the party or coalition that wins 112 seats, the number needed for a simple majority in the 222-seat lower house of parliament, will form a government. Government lowered the minimum voting age to 18 years from 21 last year. Voting is not compulsory and turnout fluctuates. Bureau Report, Sansad TV.
And our story from Mexico. Hundreds of thousands of people marched in Mexico's capital this week in a week of show to support for President Manuel López Obrador, who, before assuming the presidency, has led some of the country's biggest protests. The People's March marked 4 years in office for the leftist leader and was a response to a large opposition march 2 weeks ago to protest against López Obrador's proposal to reform the country's electoral authority. The president himself led the march through the central Mexico City. The opposition insisted that many participants were forced to join the march. López Obrador was elected to the presidency 12 years later and his Morena party won 4 of 6 races for governor in last year's midterm elections, giving the ruling party control of 22 of Mexico's 32 states, an important advantage heading into the 2024 presidential elections. But the government has been criticized for its increased use of military and its support for controversial mega projects. Moving on, Peruvian President Pedro Castillo sworn in as a new premier last week, the 5th since he took office on July 2021. Castillo named Betsy Chavez as new prime minister, a close ally and lawmaker who was previously served as Minister of Culture. Betsy Chavez Chino takes the position as head of the cabinet following the resignation of Aníbal Torres after Parliament rejected an explicit request for his backing to amend a law. The new appointment requires most of the cabinet to be reshuffled. Peruvian Prime Minister Aníbal Torres resigned on Thursday. Torres resigned after Parliament refused to debate a government bill that sought to repeal a law that had placed limits on referendums. As a result of friction between President's administration and the opposition majority legislature, the resignation is yet another sign of the crisis. Under Peruvian law, the resignation of the Prime Minister requires the resignation of the other 18 secretaries. The President may keep several ministries or reshuffle his entire cabinet. The world's longest-serving president has been re-elected to his 6th term in Equatorial Guinea to continue presiding over the authoritarian regime. Teodoro Obiang Nguema, 80, secured almost 95% of votes. Though there was a few opposition candidates, none of the teens stood a real chance to win. Obiang ruling Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea and coalition won the full 55 seats in the Senate and the 100 seats in the lower house known as the Chamber of Deputies. President Obiang has a strong grip on the oil-rich Central African nation with family members in key government roles. He seized power in 1979 after a military takeover and has survived several coup attempts. The West African country of around 1.5 million people has had only 2 presidents since independence from Spain in 1968. Obiang runs a strict authoritarian regime where political opposition is barely tolerated and there is no free press, as well as broadcast media is either owned outright by the government or controlled by its allies. And that's all we have in this edition of our program on Democracies of the World. Connect with us on various social media platforms for all the latest from around the world. Thank you for staying in. Stay tuned for informative programs on Sansad TV. Till then, goodbye. Namaskar.